Hello everyone! I am Alice of KHR Arts and Cloud Orchid Publishing, and today I want to talk to y'all about one of my favorite books, The Seer and the Sword by Victoria Hanley. Now, this particular book is a fantasy fiction book. It's a pretty classic sword and sorcery, wars, all on horseback, the cavalry, all the chivalrous knights and all of that. It's just classic high fantasy. However, what I do love about this book is that the main character, Princess Torina, is the one who ultimately saves the day, along with the secondary character, Landon. I do tend to gravitate toward novels that have strong female characters, and Princess Torina at first seems to be the stereotypical spoiled princess, but that's just because nothing's happened to her yet. She's been living a fantastic life in the Kingdom of Archeld, and she has her father, who is this brave warlord king who goes out and conquers lands, and she has a governess who takes care of her, and everybody gives her whatever she wants. Growing up in an environment like that, it's hard not to kind of become a spoiled brat. However, of course, life comes fast and hard for her because story's got a story, and her father makes the mistake of conquering the kingdom of Balandra. This is a peaceful kingdom that focuses more on the arts. They do practice the talents of war, but it's purely for contest rather than actual wartime, so they're taken over pretty easily. However, the king does, in this great battle, come across this seeress who warns him, hey dude, this wasn't the best idea you had, but you know what? Your daughter's going to need this. And before she dies, she gives him this magic crystal, and it's basically your stereotypical crystal ball for divination. And none of this is a spoiler. This is all at the beginning of the story because story's got a story. Landon is the disgraced prince of Balandra, and the king decides to keep him as a prisoner of war to just further humiliate the country. Also bad choice. The story's got a story, and basically Princess Torina and Landon become friends. Funny enough. She is the spoiled princess. He, for all intents and purposes, should hate her. She represents everything that destroyed his country. And yet they do start to become friends. And the kingdom decides to take advantage of the talents that Landon has, and they decide to put him in the royal army to train him so that they can utilize him. Because at the beginning of the story, both Landon and Princess Torina are really young. They're like children. So they believe that he's young enough that they can mold him and make him into something useful and not really have to worry about him stabbing them in the back. Because story's got a story and the two become friends, that's when things start to kind of come to the forefront that all is not well in the kingdom. There are people that don't necessarily like the king. There are people that would very much like the king to not be the king anymore. There are people who definitely are just as power hungry as the king is and would love to grab that power for themselves. Slowly but surely, the rose-colored glasses are pulled off of Princess Torina's face, and she has to face a lot of challenges real fast in order to survive. I don't want to go into the story much more beyond that, because once we get beyond that, that's when we're into real spoilers for this story. It is an absolutely fantastic high fantasy fiction story with all of the knights and round table and high fantasy battles with knights and kings and swords and horses and all that great stuff. And the magic in this book, even though it is high fantasy, it has all those awesome qualities. The magic itself is quite subtle, which I actually really like. It's one of those things where you don't really catch it at first when you're reading through this, but as you read it, you start to see more of the magic in little places in the story. Especially pay attention to the women in the story. That's where the real magic is. And I just love, without spoiling anything for y'all, that this book really highlights kind of the behind the scenes subtle things that women women did in history, especially during like the medieval time period, in order to kind of pull the strings behind the scenes to get their motivations out in the foreground, that they had to do all this stuff to basically manipulate people around them, and not necessarily in a bad way when I say manipulate, but manipulate people around them in order to get stuff done. And I just love how the magic that is shown through these women's actions really harkens to that idea that you can't just blast a dragon in the face with magic beams and whatever. That's not the kind of magic that's in this book. It's the very subtle, manipulative magic that you have to do in order to kind of slowly, progressively get things done. And I think that it's just really masterful to kind of show that idea of just what it's like to be a woman in this type of time period. Because I feel like that kind of perspective is so easily overlooked, because in a lot of ways it's not as exciting as slaying the dragon and riding off into battle and all of those sorts of high action things. So I just really love the subtlety of this story. And don't worry, there are plenty of riding into battles and slaying people and all that. There's plenty of that. There's plenty of action in this book. But I really feel like the core of the story is in the strength of that behind the scenes feminine power sort of thing going on. I haven't read anything else by this author. I feel like this story is very similar to the kind of vibe of one of my all-time favorite fantasy stories, The Daughter of the Forest, Seven Waters trilogy, Son of Shadows, Child of the Prophecy, all those books. I feel like it has very much the same vibe in that we are following this young girl character, watching her grow up, watching her see her world around her crumble, and her having to pick up the pieces and ultimately gaining her strength and coming into her own. I would say that this story is also definitely a quick read. The level of reading, I would say, is probably, and I'm not a good guesstimate for this because I was always a very advanced reader, but I would definitely say this is like middle school, early high school age. It's not complicated. There aren't like big words. It's not like there's like tons of like symbolism and highbrow themes and stuff like that. It's very much the kind of story where you're along for this fun, great ride. There's this really nice, subtle undertone of feminine power, and it's a great story that ultimately does get its happily ever after, but the happily ever after is also not quite in the way that you expect, yet still very satisfying. I highly recommend this book. It is definitely one of my favorites. I have reread it a few times, and I'm sure that y'all will enjoy it too. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please be sure to give it a like, and if you're new, subscribe. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.